You know, it all comes down to, do you want World War III, or do you want Trump to get in there with some lower taxes?
I mean, he's great for business. He's always been a business guy, America first. If America's doing strong, we help out the world. You know, that's what we do.
As Donald Trump supporters speaking to us about their support of the president-elect this week. America's underlying economic data shows this economy is outperforming many other economies around the world. And yet, exit polling suggests a large part of the voting population doesn't feel like they're getting ahead. Ryan Cummings is a visiting researcher at the Stanford Institute of Economic Policy Research and a former staff economist at the White House Council of Economic Advisors. And he's with us this morning. Kia ora, welcome to Q&A. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
How important were economic issues in determining this election result?
Yeah, I think they were top of mind for many voters. So if you look at the exit polling data, which is preliminary, and we're going to need a little longer to figure out exactly what happened, but 70% of Donald Trump voters said that the economy was their top of mind issue. For Kamala Harris supporters, on the other hand, many said things like democracy or a woman's right to choose. But for many in the economy, some research that I have along with my colleague Neil Mahoney suggests that people aren't feeling the benefits that have arisen to the U.S. economy that's outpaced many other economies globally as well.
Talk to us a little bit about that disconnect between the macroeconomic data, unemployment, growth, versus household sentiment.
Yeah, so kind of a simple way to think about it is U.S. economic conditions currently kind of mirror those of the late 1990s in the U.S. when there was low unemployment, there was high growth, and the stock market was very high. The stock market now is currently at an all-time high. And if you ask people then, how do you feel about the economy with very similar economic statistics, they would have said they feel very good. Now, with a very similar set of economic statistics, instead, they're saying they feel very poor. So what are the reasons for that in the U.S.? So some of the research that I have along with my colleague Neil Mahoney suggests inflation definitely matters. So price levels have increased, and they've stayed high. And what people really want whenever they see increasing price levels is they eventually want deflation. They want prices to go back down, but that doesn't really happen in the U.S. a lot.
Right, it doesn't really happen in many places, right?
Yeah.
So what are the implications for politicians?
So I think whenever you're designing policies in the future in the wake of a major economic shock. So for example, in 2008, we had the Great Recession, and we created the American Rescue Recovery Act in the Obama administration. The size of that stimulus was pretty small. So what was the top of mind for policymakers this time with the American Rescue Plan passed in 2021 by Joe Biden was the risk of going too small is much greater than the risk of going too big. And that resulted with some inflation, but inflation was also a global phenomena that occurred elsewhere. So for policymakers, whenever they're thinking about this next time, they don't want to forget that we did have the best recovery among the developed world and indeed in the entire world. But at the same time, you want to understand what really drove those inflation dynamics that resulted from the policy, if any.
Yeah, right. What you're saying is that in the eyes of voters, inflation is actually much more of a concern than unemployment. Is that a lesson?
Yeah, so that could be something that policymakers take away. Again, it's going to require more research, but if it was in fact the case that voters really disliked the inflation that occurred over the past 3 years, and they're just going to punish any incumbent that's going to have inflation. I mean, politicians want to get reelected, right? And so whenever they're thinking about policy, they're really going to have this at the top of mind. But again, you need to consider, too, that previously we had almost a decade in America where we had below-trend growth, we had unemployment that was very high for sustained periods of time, and people were really struggling for almost 9 years, and that was a result of not having a big, robust fiscal response. So it's really going to be, how do we strike the optimal balance between this? And economic shocks are far and few in between, so you don't get a lot of chances to do it, and you have to really try and understand the precise dynamics that occur.
Yeah, I just remember going into the COVID response, there was so much commentary from economic circles saying we can't do what we did in 2008. It's much better to overshoot and to try and pare things back than it is to undershoot and then try and lift up, from a position where we have 9 or 10% unemployment. But what you're saying is we need to try and strike a balance, and we haven't got there yet.
Yeah, and in this most recent period, there was 2 major unexpected shocks that contributed greatly to inflation. Obviously, COVID. I don't think anybody fully anticipated the degree of the supply chain stresses that occurred resulting from China's own COVID response. And then, most front of mind, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, particularly with commodities. I worked a lot in gasoline prices whenever I was in the United States, petrol prices, and those things were unforeseen. So there's not a lot you can do ex ante or before you make the policy to anticipate these kinds of shocks.
Sure. Okay, so that is the context heading into this election. But knowing what we know about that economic environment, how might the Democrats have done a better job about selling their message on the economy?
Yeah, I mean, this was something that we struggled with in the White House a lot. We were trying to highlight different economic statistics, but also success stories of individuals. So whenever looking forward, I think it's really taking a deeper look at okay, whenever people say they're unhappy, what exactly is it that they're unhappy about? And this data is hard to collect, it's hard to analyze, because everybody has maybe something that they're not happy. Tolstoy says all unhappy families are unhappy in their own way. So kind of this could be the case with consumers, but really trying to understand, okay, is it people's perceptions, for example, of the pandemic are now bleeding into their perception of the economy as well that's different? And how do you kind of respond to that? And so that's going to be a lot of different message testing, but also just designing policies. So for example, one policy that us in the Biden administration were very proud of was the child tax credit, where we gave money to parents. And this was a very good economic policy, but it didn't actually pull that well. And we invested a lot of capital in making sure that we could pass that and wanted to continue it. It didn't end up getting extended. But looking at policies kind of like that of, okay, what's both good economics and people really appreciate and feel like that makes a difference in their lives?
Yeah, it's been fascinating being at Trump rallies, because heading into the election, he essentially starts every rally with the same question. Stands up at the podium and says, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? And there was a real simplicity to his message around the economy that clearly connected with people. Is that fair?
Yeah. What's surprising about that to me is I don't know in October 2020 how many people were really loving life. I mean, we were still in the pandemic, the unemployment was high, the economy had failed to catch up. So that was surprising to me anyways, that message resonated, because I thought that was one of the most clear, are you better off, than 4 years ago, the answer being yes. But obviously, there's just been a lot of upheaval in the world, in the economy. There's been a lot of global realignments with the Russian war in Ukraine. And just in the US, the way things have changed, the demographics have changed. So I think people are just trying to wrestle with a lot of uncertainty that's happening in the world right now and projecting that onto their feelings of the economy.
New Zealand has an export-dependent economy, obviously, and so there's a lot of interest on what the implications might be for tariffs if they were to be imposed by the new administration. What do you think voters understand about tariffs and Donald Trump's planned 20% tariffs?
Yeah, so I think from the voter perspective, there's a very understandable feeling that if you're from a working class area, for example, in the Rust Belt in the United States, you had been left behind by the quote unquote China shock of the early 2000s. And so that's obviously what Donald Trump came riding into office in 2016. And there's clearly a staying message to that power. Now, what's so dangerous about tariffs is economists typically think about tariffs as a scalpel to use. So for example, in situations with national security, putting tariffs maybe on Russian goods, or where there might be market dumping occurring, for example, with Chinese tires or something like that. Now, Donald Trump is saying he wants to use a hammer instead of a scalpel. And we know tariffs are passed on one for one almost to consumers. So a 20% tariff is going to be something close to a 20% price increase. So if you dislike inflation, you're really going to dislike these tariffs. And two, tariffs are pretty regressive, meaning they fall most heavily on the poorest income households who, for example, are buying a lot of goods that are imported, maybe lamb from New Zealand or something like this. And they benefit or don't affect richer households as well. So as the Trump administration is looking into that, they really need to consider, okay, how are we going to do this in a targeted way, if at all? Because you really don't want to go spark a wave of global uncertainty, both for security reasons and obviously for economic reasons as well.
Finally, Ryan, that line we often return to when thinking about US politics, James Carville's "It's the economy, stupid." Once again, for all of the issues that were dominating this election campaign, be it abortion access, be it some of the social issues that Democrats have made much of, ultimately it was the economy, you think, that decided this election?
Yeah, again, it's going to be hard, and the exit polling data we have now is just asking people as they're leaving the voting booth, why did you vote the way you did? But, you know, Donald Trump, to his credit, has a very simple message. Are you better off 4 years ago? Even if that's not necessarily, I would argue, the case, but he has a very simple message, and he was able to kind of highlight a lot of people's pain very well. And I think for Democrats, it's really the people who I've been talking to in the campaign in the White House, the main feeling is humility. And we need to understand what we don't currently understand if people in the Democratic Party want to win a presidential election in the near future.
We very much appreciate you being here with us today. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much.